My name is Gregory Voigt, and this is my midterm presentation for Entertainment Finance. The date is March 16th, 2020. For my midterm presentation, I decided to discuss the relatively muted financial performance of the films of Paramount Pictures in the last 4 calendar years, specifically starting in January of 2016. Paramount Pictures is an icon of Hollywood. However, in the last 4 years, the films that the studio has released have not done so well on average. The studio has released 50 films in theatrical release, and of those 50 films, 26, that's 52%, failed to double their production budgets at the worldwide box office. This is concerning because, on average, a film studio can expect to retrieve 50% of the revenue made by their films at the worldwide box office. 50% they can expect to get back. The rest goes to movie theaters. But there are a few things that I believe Paramount Pictures can do to boost its financial performance and reestablish the brand that is Paramount Pictures. Now, I am a big fan of Paramount Pictures. It's one of the iconic studios of Hollywood, but the reality is the studio has struggled in the last while. In January of 2016, Paramount Pictures released Michael Bay's film, 13 Hours, The Secret Soldiers of Benghazi. This film had a production budget of approximately $50 million, but worldwide, it only made $69 million. And this financial loss was a trend that unfortunately kept creeping up for Paramount over the last 4 years. It was a co-distributor along with MGM on the recent Ben-Hur remake, which also came out in 2016, that carried an estimated $100 million production budget and worldwide only made $94 million. Within the span of about 6 weeks, last fall, Paramount released 2 films, the Will Smith-led Gemini Man and the Terminator reboot, Terminator Dark Fate. Both of these films had massive $100+ million production budgets, and both of these films cost the studio tens of millions of dollars. However, Paramount has had a number of successes in the last few years. In 2018, it released 2 films that were significant successes for the studio. The first one was John Krasinski's horror film A Quiet Place, which on a $17 million production budget made $300+ million worldwide, and Mission Impossible Fallout, which made almost $800 million worldwide on a $178 million production budget. So there is hope for Paramount, and recently they released Sonic the Hedgehog, which has already made over $300 million worldwide on an $80 million budget. Instead of discussing all the reasons why I believe Paramount has struggled in the past, although those do overlap with the topic of this presentation, I instead want to discuss what I believe Paramount can do going forward to change this negative box office trend that it's been on in the last few years. Number 1, reduce the budgets of the films you produce. Terminator Dark Fate was an R-rated action film that carried a production budget of $185 million. Lest we forget, the original Terminator film, which came out in the mid-1980s, cost less than 10. Even with inflation, that number is nowhere close to $185 million in today's dollars. One of the moderate successes that Paramount actually had this past year was the reboot of Stephen King's Pet Sematary, which carried a $21 million production budget and made approximately $113 million worldwide. That's a modest, honest success for this studio. And if it continues to make films in the mid-range, then A, it won't lose as much money, and B, it can establish itself as the studio that has limited its budgets. The second thing is that the studio needs to invest in high-caliber filmmakers. In 2018, Paramount released Alex Garland's Annihilation, which had a $40 million production budget and worldwide grossed about $43 million. The film was well received, but it did lose a significant amount of money. However, it was an artistically driven, filmmaker-centric film that Paramount backed. Paramount also backed A Quiet Place, which was a John Krasinski filmmaker-centered film that, with its modest budget, made great profits for the studio. If Paramount invests in high-caliber filmmaking talent and gives them modest mid to low budgets, it can reap significant rewards, and it can establish itself in the film industry as the studio that prioritizes the filmmaker. Now, that does not mean that they completely move away from franchises. The Mission Impossible films, as I mentioned, are remarkable financial successes for the studio. But the studio needs to establish itself as being at the forefront of the filmmaking experience. The third, and perhaps most important thing, is it needs to re-examine its marketing campaigns. Looking at the trailers for, say, Terminator Dark Fate, it plays a lot on the nostalgia of those movies. The problem is, as Scott Mendelson, writing for Forbes, said, look, Terminator is not Star Wars. Therefore, you cannot market it like you'd market Star Wars. With each project that Paramount releases, it has to focus on the marketing campaigns, and especially it needs to establish what this film is. And not only what it is, why you, the audience, should pay money to see it in a movie theater. The best way to do this, arguably, is to make a movie with a strong central concept. A Quiet Place is about a family that must survive in a world wherein they cannot make a single noise, because if they do, monsters will come out and eat them. This is an eye-catching concept because it asks the audience, would you survive? Paramount needs to re-examine how it markets films. And I think it needs to prioritize two things. One, it needs to explain to the audience what this film is. I mentioned Annihilation earlier. Well, if you watch the trailers for Annihilation, at no point do they ever fully explain what kind of a movie an audience member could expect to see when said audience member pays a ticket to see Annihilation in a movie theater. The same is not true for A Quiet Place, or even for Mission Impossible. When you pay money to see a Mission Impossible movie, you're going to see Tom Cruise perform some crazy stunts and have a great time watching him do so. What is this movie fundamentally about, and why should an audience member pay a ticket to see this movie? Those are the two questions that Paramount must ask in its marketing campaign. So to recap, the three things that I think Paramount Pictures should do are: 1, reduce the budget of films. Do not spend $185 million on films like Terminator. Those films just do not warrant the expense, and you cannot expect them, honestly, to make the necessary money worldwide to break even. Number 2, invest in filmmakers. Make sure that you give filmmakers creative freedom with restrictions, particularly monetary restrictions, but make sure they have the freedom to tell their story and give them the money and, more importantly, the time to get those stories right. And the third, and I believe the most important thing, is to re-examine how you market movies to the public. What is this movie about, and why should an audience member pay money to see this movie? Well, that will do it for my midterm presentation on Paramount Pictures. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.